Welcome to the India Development Debate. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. An uproar and a U-turn. That is the story of the draft education policy released by the government and then amended in a span of just a couple of days. The draft education policy 2019 proposes, among other things, a strong emphasis on the three-language formula and in fact suggests that students start learning three languages even earlier than they currently do. But which languages is the question? After the original version of the draft seemed to suggest that Hindi should be made mandatory in southern Indian states, a huge backlash followed. The draft was suitably amended to make the choice of three languages voluntary. But what is the truth behind the so-called U-turn? More importantly, what is the vision of this new education policy? To speak on this and more, I am joined now by Dr. K. Kasturi Rangan, Chairman, National Education Policy Committee. I'm also speaking today with Yamini Iyer, President and Chief Executive, Center for Policy Research, Meeta Sengupta, Education Strategist, and Sanjay Hegde, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India. But I'll first begin by talking with Mr. Kasturi Rangan. Mr. Kasturi Rangan, welcome to the show. I must start by asking you the question about the Hindi imposition, or as it was seen as an imposition of Hindi in the original draft policy. Were you misinterpreted or were you first forced to take a U-turn?
Well, language is always a very sensitive issue in any educational policy. And what was put into the policy in the appropriate place regarding the three-language formula and the flexibility was a part of a spirit of the language policy that we had formulated, which is to provide flexibility to all the states to decide on what their language should be, the chosen within the three-language formula. Unfortunately, we thought that the type of formulation for that particular para of the three-language policy and the flexibility conveys the spirit of the thing, which is related to the fact that we recognize the multilingualism and pluralism of the language, and the states have the necessary flexibility to make the choices. But unfortunately, it was interpreted as one in which the Hindi is being imposed in the southern states, which was not really the purpose of that particular para. But as an afterthought, when we go through that contents of that particular para, it looks to us that probably it is little out of step with the rest of the framework that we have for the policy of the languages, and therefore we quickly replaced it because we had another approved version of the policy which was more in tune, later on we realized, with the rest of the policy framework. And so today we have replaced it and made sure that our message is right with respect to how it will reach the reader. And we hope that that will assuage the feelings that the original version had created.
Well, in the meantime, Mr. Kasturi Rangan, this debate has erupted with one side saying that Hindi must be taught all over India. Why not? The other side saying, of course, this is an imposition. Where do you stand on this debate in this particular school of thought that why not let Hindi be taught across the country?
I think the learning of Hindi is not something which is not possible within the framework of this policy, number one. And if you really look at the South Indian states, many of them have carried forward the Hindi learning sufficiently, I say admirably. In fact, if you look at the southern the chapter of the Hindi Prachar Sabha, they have one of the very active things, and many South Indians certainly have taken advantage, and we all learn. We learn and speak Hindi without any difficulty. So I think there is no such concern that Hindi will not be learned just because there is no policy that directs them that you should make this mandatory. I think most of the language studies now is in the voluntary regime, except the medium of instruction in the local areas. For example, in Karnataka, you learn Kannada in the either it could be the local Kannada version, or it could be related to the home spoken version, or it could be the mother tongue. So that kind of a thing will continue, and certainly the preferences will be there among the families and among the various entities in a particular state, where they would also like to learn Hindi. So this is not prohibited by the policy. So I don't think that this is by itself a major concern, that Hindi will not be learned just because it is not in the policy as a mandatory learning, but certainly all languages have the flexibility of being adopted by the states and learned. But our idea is to make sure that consistent with the flexibility that we want to give to the state, they will decide it and how they will adopt those languages. And so, we have left it to the states. So, I do not think that and that is also important, simply because of the fact that we can't tell any state that you should learn this language or that language, because that is not consistent with the kind of things that we have been doing.
Yes, but you have asked for the 3-language formula to be implemented from even earlier on. Why is there such a thrust on languages in this draft policy?
Yes, you know, the present policy has also delved deep into the question of cognitive sciences and those that are related to the neural development of the child, emotive development of the child. And we find that the ages between 3 years and 8 years are the optimum in terms of the ability to pick up new languages and new modes of communication. We need to exploit this capacity of the child, this capability of the child and the potential capacity of the child in picking up multiple languages in this period. So, that is why we have recommended that right from the age 3, in fact, between age 3 and the age 8, 80% of the brain is developed, and the language pickup capability is enormous. So, we take advantage of this now known facts about the neural science, cognitive science, and start learning the languages right from the age 3. Three languages can be put according to the neural scientists and other experts, and then we can take it forward up to 8, and where they can quickly master 3 languages, and if necessary we can even add further languages, because there is a capacity according to the scientists that we can have more number of languages. So, that is not a concern, that starting from third year in the education to the education of the 8 and beyond, certainly language learning is a prominent capability that we need to put into the child, and that is what the policy reflects.
Well, on the other hand, there is also a kind of reading down of English as a medium of instruction in various parts of your policy. As I have read it, you are asking why English should be given the prominence it does have. Do you not want it to be a medium of instruction? What is your view on English language?
No, if you carefully have read this document, that answer is there, but I will reiterate that. The point is that you have languages of India which are enormously rich and carries a lot of traditions and rich cultural traditions. But the important thing is that the Indian languages certainly have to be developed. That is one aspect of it, because we need to make sure that they are not lost in the antiquity. The other part of it is with respect to languages which are necessary, because either they become international languages or used by majority of the countries where various types of critical activities go on, and it is up to us as a global power to be in touch with them. It is here the importance of the English comes in. So as one we have not underestimated the importance of the local languages to be learned in this language policy. We also think that time is not ripe for us to completely replace English, because we need yet to know the Western science, Western technology and many other aspects of Western civilization in the context of our own global role, and English becomes an important language in that connection, and therefore, we have recommended that English should be an important language from that perspective.
But till a certain age, are you insisting that English not be made the medium of instruction?
No, we have not. We have put the 3-language formula, and in which most of the states have adopted English as one of the important languages, and they could continue with that. We have no objection to that. In fact, if they are pragmatic, they will decide on what is the best way to go.
Yes, but for example, how pragmatic is the focus on Sanskrit? For example, the draft policy as a whole, in fact, talks a lot about reflecting, the cultural glory and the past heritage of India, which is excellent, but it is being seen by some as a way to impose one singular kind of thinking across the country. Are those fears unfounded in your view?
That's totally unfounded, because I think this particular policy and the committee members who worked in this policy and the type of people who helped us to formulate this policy, they are all people with the highest level of ethics and integrity and eminence in this country, who are quite independent in their way, very frank in their way, and I have to say that we are quite happy with the effort that we put in for the last 1.5 years, with no other consideration than the fact that this is what India should have. So, I want to have this preamble made it very clear. The second part of it is that the Indian culture, if you look at the current educational phenomenon and the kind of things that the students are studying, a country with millennia of civilization and the type of status and the prestige we enjoyed among the community of nations, I think is not reflected even for 10% of the type of things we learn in the present educational system. The country is going to become the fifth largest economy in the next few years, and maybe in another 10-15 years will be the third largest economy. Enormous amount of economic power, and attendant with this is many other areas. This is the time the country really looks for its own value system, its traditions, its heritage, and if we don't study that aspect of it, at least as a part of our initial education in this country, and know your country first before you start knowing about other things, I think we will be doing unfair things to this entire effort. So, we have taken cognizance of the fact that India's rich heritage, rich tradition, which may be in the language, in terms of a Panchatantra, it could be related to some kind of a other kind, and Kalidasa's works, many kind of this kind of a thing. I think we should try to bring it in, and that is all we have tried to do. And it is not only that, when it comes to language, you said about the Sanskrit as the thing. We have said Sanskrit and all the Indian classical language. In fact, we have named every classical language is of importance in the Republic and said that we should create capabilities for teaching this classical language. In fact, we have spent a lot of time on the language issue, simply because I think we need to do much more in developing the very classical languages. That includes Sanskrit, but many other languages of the Indian origin in different contexts. And so, I don't think that this is something which is just put there. It is in the context of the type of times we are in, and the type of direction that we are going to have in the coming years, and to be in consonance with that kind of India's image. I think knowledge in this area is very vital in our view.
That's true, Mr. Kasturi Rangan, but I just must ask, how much of emphasis has been given in this policy to what those who are students today and our children are going to face in the future? Technology is changing at a very fast pace. One's not sure what the jobs of the future are going to be. Artificial intelligence is going to change the way we work as humans. Is the policy going to keep our children in tune with the times?
In fact, there are two important things we have considered in the context of the draft policy. One is, of course, the global sustainable development goals, which includes quality of education, as you know, as important thing. The second is the fourth industrial revolution, which is where you are bringing in the question of artificial intelligence, expert systems, machine intelligence, and all those kind of a thing. We have made sure that we have the educational program which will address these questions, and the right level of education. Even computer and digital literacy is now made a part of the school education. That is the preparation that we are trying to do in the early phase of the education of a child, and this will be built up successively over the areas, not only with respect to curriculum and pedagogy, and ultimately a fairly large research program which will address this kind of a thing. And the research program itself, coming to that, I would say that we have recommended a National Research Foundation which will upgrade the university system, particularly 800 and odd universities in this country, which needs attention in the context of research, not only in the context of creating the right faculty, right capability, the right infrastructure, but also the right kind of outcomes that will come out of it. It's going to be a protracted and long-term affair, but we need to start it. And I would say that the present situation is not at all satisfactory in the area of research in universities. So, we have created this. It will support four major areas: science, technology and engineering, social sciences and humanities, and there will be a fairly large governmental funding which will be available for the 800 and odd institutions, and also it will be based on the competitive basis. It will also be based on the need to seed these kind of research capabilities in India. We will create a special cadre of vendors depending on the availability in the local geography, and finally also the industry participating in it and recognizing good research work. So, this is going to be a long term, but a very directed program of strengthening the research system in the university. And if we do not strengthen this in the coming years, we are not going to have a real good scientific basis in this country to develop ourselves as a power to be reckoned with, not only in the context of strategic capability, but more equally importantly our manufacturing and industrial capability.
Absolutely.
And many other domains of national endeavor.
Well, thank you for all of your clarifications, Mr. Kasturi Rangan. I want to come to all of our guests on the show. Unfortunately, Mr. Kasturi Rangan has another engagement to leave too, but we've managed to get the key questions out of him. So, thank you for that. Meeta Sen-Gupta, just let me come in with your responses to some of the points that have been made, because a huge furore has been about the imposition of Hindi. Clearly, they realized that this was not going down too well. They backtracked. But overall, a lot of the policy does focus on languages and the 3-language formula, which I found very interesting. Is it feasible to start teaching much younger children? They talk about starting this from the age of 3, in fact, 3 languages.
See, actually catches up with reality. And firstly, of course, I want to congratulate them on finally getting the policy out. And I want to congratulate them on listening to the people. It has been a 4-year listening exercise. And all the things that all of us have been saying for the longest time have finally found their way into policy. The technology that you want to talk about, and that also maps with the language question, is really going to impact the future of the country. 3 languages may be too much in theory. We should have some questions raised about student workload, especially going up to class 3, 4, 5. But what is happening even now in classrooms is teaching, even in English medium schools, actually happens both in the local language and in English. So the policy is merely catching up with what happens. Comprehension, obviously, across languages is a transitional thing. So let us start with local languages. I completely support that. Of course, we have the question of people who are migrating across the country, etc., and their local language and their own language is not the same. Details that will need to be worked out, but also moving over the years to languages that bring in social and economic mobility are really important. So if social and economic mobility happens across states, that's the language you want to focus on. Depth of understanding, mastery of content, and then social and economic mobility are the goals of the language policy. So having multiple languages is absolutely essential to even economic progress of the individual. In addition to the fact that you learn things across different languages, you build layers of depth. Kasturi Ranganji already spoke about the neural impact of multiple languages, where you're able to process the same story in different ways. Story taking across multiple languages improves learning outcomes dramatically.
Absolutely. Let me bring in Sanjay Hegde. And Sanjay Hegde, you responded to the whole, language controversy by saying that if 3 languages should be taught, they should be English, Mandarin, and one more. And I just want to focus on that a bit, because look at the context of the trouble we're in. The same draft policy says that currently maybe over 5 crore children in elementary school don't have foundational literacy and numeracy. That means they can't really read and can't understand numbers. And here we're haggling over which language children learn in which state.
Absolutely. You see, they should be functionally literate at least in one language. Even that doesn't seem to be happening, and that's because a lot of our teaching, especially in government schools, is not exactly up to the mark. I did suggest that there should be English, Mandarin and another local language of choice, simply because English is the language internationally, and it is the language of the internet. Mandarin because that is our biggest neighbor, our biggest trading partner, and a country which is aiming for world dominance next on your neighborhood. So, the more people that can interact with them on their own language and work into their culture, the better it is for the country. The third language, leave it to the children or the parents' choice, and often it is more likely to be the mother tongue or the local language. But the basic argument which seems to have come out from the policy in the first version was that you can impose your choice. The world does make choices for you in your choice in languages, yes, but that a government should make that choice that we shall have a national language which we will create a dominant majoritarian language which will overpower everything else. That certainly is not on, especially in our neighborhood. We have seen what happened to Pakistan when it tried to impose Urdu on Bengalis. We must remember what happened in Sri Lanka when Sinhala was imposed on the Tamils. If you try to efface a language,
but they backtracked.
And say that
yeah, but Mr. Hegde, they backtracked. There was what? There was a day of furore and they backtracked. So, do you think it was a genuine mistake, or it was an attempt to sort of test the waters and see what the reaction would be, and clearly there are strong reactions?
See, the current government comes from a political milieu which believes in Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, and this is not something which has started now. It's pre-independence. So, given that every attempt that they come out with a policy which anywhere indicates an attempt to go back to that will naturally face some level of skepticism, and correctly they have backed off. I must remind you that we have had these language problems in India itself. We have had what was called the Punjabi Suba agitation, which then almost led later on to the Khalistan agitation. People who do not remember the lessons of history are condemned to repeat those mistakes, and I just don't want my country to do that again.
Let me bring Yamini into this discussion, and Yamini, the politics of this whole thing has moved very fluidly in the last 24 and 48 odd hours. So, it's clear that as of now the draft policy is not imposing any specific language. The original wording made it sound like it was, but they have clarified. They still are very keen that 3 languages are taught from a very young age. The focus on language, the focus on languages like Sanskrit. Do you think that is in keeping with the current times and the job market? For a majority of Indians, education is a vehicle of social upliftment for pretty much all Indians actually. You're studying so that you can go on to do better than, what your family has done so far.
Sure. Thanks, Tamanna. A couple of things. I think one interesting takeaway for me from the furrow of the last few days is, in essence, democracy works. It is. I am not in the government. I do not know the proceedings or the motivations. But if we were to take Dr. Kasturi Rajan's word for it, there was the intent was articulated in a way that allowed for interpretation of imposition. And as soon as there was political pushback, and the southern states very evocatively articulated the complexities of a central government trying to impose language, there was a pushback, and the government has walked back and attempted to change the language to ensure that that states are going to be the decision makers on what these 3 languages are. So, I see actually in all the political back and forth and furrow of the last 3 days an important reminder that democracy works. works, diversity works, and it is very important to have political diversity because ultimately politics is able to push back to ensure that right is corrected. So that was the first thing I wanted to say. When it comes to this question of the imposition of 3 languages, it is important to go back to what Mr. Hegde just said. And in fact, the national education policy very clearly states this upfront. The fact of the matter is that that a significant proportion of students that are going into elementary schools in India are spending 5 and up to 8 years. India today has more numbers of children that are completing 8 years of schooling than ever before in its history, and are basically barely able to recognize letters and words. We know from survey after survey, 50% of standard 5 students can barely read a standard 2 text. The challenge for India is on getting basic foundational learning right, and the NEP very clearly articulates that front and center. And I think it must be congratulated for it. This is not something that is not known. It's not something that has not found its way in policy documents over the years, but to put it front and center and remind the nation that foundational learning is critical to the future of education is very important to state in a document like this. And in fact, the question of language is embedded in that. We do know from pedagogists that learning in local languages in the mother tongue is actually very, very important in early years of schooling to be able to grasp those basic skill sets and acquire basic foundational learning skills. So in that sense, beginning with local languages and trying to address bilinguality through that is probably, I think, a sensible policy. Also important to recognize that English is the language of mobility, and English is the language of aspiration. If you look at the numbers of students that are moving out of the government schooling system into private schooling system, one of the motivations is English.
Exactly.
So you will see parents are also exercising choice, and ultimately these tensions will be played out.
No, but you know,
I think you must remember, in the end, these tensions will be played out in how parents respond to the schooling system.
no, Yamini, I'm sorry. I just want to come in, and it's actually reinforcing your point. And let me open this up to debate. In the policy, it says when possible.
Sure, sorry, I couldn't hear you very well.
Problem.
So, yeah.
When possible, the medium of instruction at least until grade 5, but preferably till at least grade 8, will be the home language / mother tongue / local language. Thereafter, the home or local language will be continued to be taught as a language wherever possible. Hand to heart, how many parents who have the choice would want their children to study till even grade 8 in the local language? Again, it comes back to how it will prepare them for the jobs that everyone's aspiring to. Let me come back to Meeta on this.
Absolutely right. Sorry.
So can I just say one thing before Meeta comes in?
Yes, Yamini. Yes.
No, Meeta, I just wanted to say one thing. I think that there is an important tension that's worth highlighting, and any education policy will have to work through this. There is no argument that perhaps parental choice is moving in the direction of English, because English is seen as a language of mobility and the language of aspiration. But everything that and Meeta will be able to speak to this better than I, everything that educationists and pedagogists will tell you, learning, especially in the early stages, is most effective when it is in the local language and in the mother tongue. So how we play out that tension is going to be important, and it is part of the policy implementation challenge to be able to engage with all stakeholders in the education system to find the right balance.
Yes, Meeta, please come in.
Completely agree, Yamini. When we are talking about nursery, early years, it is really important to talk to students in their local language. They are little babies, they're little children. They will be able to understand one language, which is why one very important aspect that has been written into this policy document, which is about bilingual teaching and provision of bilingual resources all the way from early education to higher education. And the provision and the budgeting for that is one of the most significantly progressive parts of this document. Because when we enable children with freedom, with flexibility, with choice, with engagement at the local level, and I'm talking classrooms over here, at the classroom level, when you are able to decide that this student individually is able to transition into 80% language X and 20% Y and so on and so forth. That is the individual progression pathway that we are supposed to be working towards. And this is why it comes in the policy document, because the policy is not a law. It is a guideline. It is something that raises the game for all of us and tells us educationists and strategists saying, go forth. I'm giving you the chance to make it happen for every student. I'm giving every
True,
student.
that's true. I'm sorry, but Meeta, let me come here. It still doesn't answer the question that I've been
Challenge.
asking.
Sorry, can I finish the sentence?
Yes.
The challenge here is how you implement it in practice. Now, in practice, if parents and students choose and transition effectively to the language of mobility, to English or whatever the language where jobs are, whether it is Chinese, whether it is Manipuri, whichever language it is, if they transition to that language of mobility, and let's not doubt the fact that students learn for employment as well. This decade is about employment as well. So if we are able to rise to the challenge, we would have been able to meet the aspirations of both the nation and the guidelines of the policy. Thank you.
No, yeah, obviously, but that's the point about English, and it doesn't really fully answer the question. Let me get Mr. Hegde into this, because the draft policy says, despite
Tamanna,
one minute. Despite the rich, expressive and scientific nature of Indian languages, there has been an unfortunate trend in schools and society towards English as a medium of instruction and as a medium of conversation. Mr. Hegde, I'm focusing on, the outlook towards the English language in this policy. And herein, I believe, lies the real debate, not the superfluous one we've been seeing on social media and Twitter over the last couple of days. A lot of our kids find themselves inundated with instruction in English. They cannot understand it, but everyone wants to eventually aspire to learn English because it's seen as the language that will take you forward.
That's always been the situation, especially in India. There has been the language of power and there has been the language of the masses. You must remember that the Buddha preached in Prakrit and not in Sanskrit. Equally, the language of the courts in the Mughal era and right up to the Maratha court was Persian. So, those were the languages which people learned for employment, for mobility, for job prospects and everything. And on the other hand, there was the language of the house. Now, one language does not necessarily grow bigger by putting down another. That is the basic mistake. It is not a zero sum game. We may need, we do need English, we do need Chinese for our employment and for continuing business. But at home, or when we sit down to think, when we sit down to write, we may have our own languages. There is nothing which prevents you from learning your own language or whichever language that you want. But to say that those languages do not develop because people learn English as a choice, that is a false binary. And I think that the debate more or less ended in 1965. You see, we were in a different situation when we were writing in the constitution, when we were creating a new nation. Then Israel, for instance, had rebuilt Hebrew, which had been which had totally gone defunct. India thought that it could do something like that. But after the South rose up, after it was decided in 1965 that English would continue, the English language gave us our view out into the world, especially into the world of business process outsourcing, especially into the world of the internet. Now, we had an advantage over those nations which did not speak English. The language of English, as some other speakers have said, is also the language of mobility.
Right. Yes.
There have been, for instance, Dalit movements and Dalit philosophers who have emphasized English to be a goddess of social mobility. Now, given all that, you cannot say that we can tear down English and then go back to whatever other language which we think is Indian. English has been an Indian language for the last 200 years. We have our own version of English now.
That is true.
So, I don't think we should now discriminate against English.
I get you. I have very little time, but I do want closing comments from everyone on the panel. So, if you will indulge me, Yamini, very quick closing comment, please.
Sure. I think that we should think about the new education policy in the context of the crisis that education faces in India. The first crisis is that we have a large number of children that are entering the education system and sitting through years of schooling but not learning. That crisis needs to be solved frontally, and most importantly, you will not have an educated workforce, no matter what language you teach in, if their basic foundational learning skills are not addressed. The policy is an attempt in that direction. The devil is going to lie in the detail of implementation. Yes. The question of language will eventually resolve itself in the ways in which parents exercise choice, and there's absolutely no question English is going to be central. It is going to remain central. It is a language of unifying, and I didn't read this policy necessarily as an attempt to take away from English. I read this policy as an attempt to address the tension between learning in local languages and the vernacular and the aspiration of English. Absolutely. That is how I hope state governments interpret it and implement it going forward. That's where the future of education is going to lie.
Meeta, any very quick last comments?
Very quickly, completely agree with both of them. Devil lies in the details. A policy document has to be implemented well for it to work well. English continues to remain the language of mobility. We will continue to have to work towards English in the older classes and the older ages, but we need to support our students much better in the early years and the foundational years. Completely agree, which is why we may even want to think even further ahead than the policy has, moving ahead from digital literacy to digital creativity.
Absolutely.
We need to become a nation of makers, not receivers of policy or receivers of language. Right now we are receiving these directions from global movements. We need to be able to, with our workforce, if we educate them well in the early years.
Yes, I will have to close it here. But I want to thank all of you for taking part in this debate. Remember, it's a draft policy. It's out there for the public to read, to think about, and to comment on. Please go ahead and do that if you really wish to be a part of how this country frames its policy. I'll take a very quick break over here, but we're coming back with a superb face-off. Is the entire narrative of the rural crisis exaggerated, and have the Lok Sabha election results proven that? That's one theory. It's going to be countered. We'll be right back.